to be here and invest some time with us. So we're going to make it fun, engaging, and hopefully educational, and have you walk away with some tangible things that you can take back to your organizations. So we're really here to have a discussion about the ways that the employee life cycle is evolving during the pandemic. And so when we talk about life cycle, we want to speak over the next 30, 40 minutes about hiring and inclusion and everything that goes into that, such as sourcing, which Corey can lean his expertise on. But also we're going to hear from Georgina and Sam as well, in terms of how do we think about onboarding, learning and development, even offboarding if it needs to get to that. But we're also going to go with the flow of the conversation. So to kick us off, I want to frame the conversation just by saying, diversity, equity, and inclusion is really a marathon. And I learned that looking at it as maybe like a mountain, right? And when people scale to the summit of mountains, they tend to have base camps, right? Little checkpoints where they set milestones and are making tangible progress. So before we get into how to hire and find diverse talent, Corey, can you speak on maybe how companies can be more inclusive for underrepresented talent before they even get in the door? Hey, Corey, your audio may be attached to a different source. How about that?
No.
I'm going to give Corey 1 second as we think about how to hire diverse talent. While Corey is working on his audio, Georgina, would you like to lean in here? I know we're going to get to onboarding L&D a little bit later, but would you like to share your 2 cents as we get Corey settled?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I think that when we talk about the employee experience and trying to create an inclusive workplace, a lot of people talk about, hiring and making sure we have diverse practices in hiring, but also making sure the workplace is somewhere that once folks are hired, they feel included and want to stay. One of the biggest problems in attracting underrepresented talent is retaining them, because they're told this is going to be a place you're made to feel like you belong. This is a place that we're going to include you, and then they get in, and nothing has been done to make sure that folks who traditionally don't have voices outside of tech feel like they can use their voices there. And so, my specialty is onboarding, but also just having been an employee for the last 10 years, there are ways that leaders really need to listen to employee communities, listen to the experiences of folks. If people are saying a policy is leaving people behind, if people are saying there's inequalities in the way people negotiate for salary or start date, that from the get-go kind of set up employment practices, it's your employees who have those experiences and can really help you make changes for the better. I mean, outside consultants are amazing and can give a lot of insight, but if you're not listening to your employees in the first place, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble. And so I think instead of rattling off a list of practices, I think one of the things that we can all do is just listen a little bit more. And Corey, I'd love to let you kind of take this question.
Yeah, hopefully, is my sound working now?
Yes.
Okay, I see some thumbs up. I see some head nods. So yeah, one of the prime thing in navigating this virtual world that we live in is really around empathy and flexibility. So hopefully you all have some empathy for me and not having my audio working. And thanks, Georgina, for jumping in and being flexible while we sort of talk about hiring and inclusion. But yeah, I think you hit the nail spot on the head. I think the first thing that I would comment as we think about providing an environment for underrepresented minorities, and even for the company as a whole, it's a total company effort, right? It is not just the folks that have been historically having to deal with this, or as one of the onlys in the room to get their opinions, right? So it is a total company effort of a cross-functional group of people to figure out, as Georgina was saying, what the employee experience is like, right? This is not just the I&Ds team or the inclusion and diversities team's role to do this. Yes, some companies, right, have those resources, but how can we all become more conversant and have a deeper acumen of inclusion, right? And so I think that that's one tangible thing that companies can do, is really focus and emphasize how to build acumen and competency building, right? How do we talk about inclusivity? What are the things we can say? What are the things we can't say? How do we just address the elephant in the room and assume that everybody is on a different part of this journey, right? And so many things have happened over the last year, and that we just have to meet people where we are. And so part of the listening is also, as leaders and as individuals of the company, how do we create safety and open spaces for people to talk, right? Because you can listen, but if folks don't feel safe, you'll never really truly hear the experience. So it's really important. The second point of this is to really create safety and a space to talk. And then the last couple of things, and I'll wrap it up here, is how are you empowering your employee resource groups and allies, right? And if they're not there, to create them, right? So there's a huge emphasis historically. ERGs and allyship programs are under-resourced, underfunded, and so how do we give them more sort of autonomy and responsibility and empowerment to help drive this for the companies? And again, it's not just the ERGs, it's also allies at the company, which are just as critical in moving this forward.
Anthony, if I could comment on one really practical tip.
Please do.
From the legal side, I think there's always this tension, right? Because people want to go, oh my goodness, we can't say that, or we have to run this by legal, or we have to have this communication in silo, and then we can talk about it and we can put it up on a slide. And what we know to be true is that it's absolutely the opposite of that. And so, as Georgina said, listening to your employees, as Corey said, you have to take that into account. So one really practical step that I recommend within my own company, but also to others, is have listening and learning sessions. They don't have to have a huge archetype around them. They don't have to have a set agenda. They have to have a way to have a forum, as Corey said, of safety, of understanding, and of transparency. Even in legal land, when you miss the mark on something, you say, we missed the mark on this, and now we're gonna do better this next time. And that's okay, that's progress, that's movement. But that's a really practical tip that we found really useful, is just getting these sessions on the books. And I think you'll find within most companies, people will attend, people will come, and even if they don't feel comfortable the first time sharing their voice, they're there to listen. They're part of the learning journey and the listening journey as well. And the more you can encourage that behavior at every level within the company, CEO, board, and all of your leaders and all of the employees, it becomes a really powerful tool for companies.
And
one other quick thing. Oh, I'm sorry, Georgina, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and have these listening sessions and have a way to make next steps in a plan. Give someone 50% of their role to be the program manager to make the meaningful changes. This can't be something that people do on top of their daily work. What we're going to talk about a lot in this conversation is that we're at home. We have different priorities, caregiving for parents or children, or partners who might be in need right now. And so if you're going to have the listening sessions, have a meaningful way to have a next step, give someone the full time of their job to do that, because a lot of underrepresented folks spend a lot of time talking to leaders and seeing nothing happen. And then they spent, 2 hours being vulnerable, reopening scars, maybe going through some employment trauma, and then for nothing. And so we need to make sure that we hear and we set the right expectations in those conversations, and then we set the right expectations on follow through.
Yeah, the last point I was going to make, and this is where I think that there's some natural synergy between legal and the talent side, is even having an understanding of your company's openness to measure your activities. Again, it's going to vary drastically from a lot of different places, but at least getting some guidance from your legal team on how and if you're able to measure your efforts. And that can be in a variety of different ways, and that's going to be largely company specific. But you know, you can't measure or noticeably change something if you don't measure it. And so again, having some guidance there could really help move the needle on these efforts.
Gotcha. Thank you all for sharing. What I heard was a recap was, if you want to create psychological safety, it starts with listening intentionally and also learning together, and creating space for that to continue really happening. But as Georgina said, having someone who's also going to say, you know, be more of a program manager and follow up and create a cadence of accountability from this. I guess a follow-up to that is, speaking of education, from all of you, who are some thought leaders that maybe managers and companies should be following to help educate themselves along this journey and hold themselves accountable if they want to make a change?
I find myself listening to Arlen Hamilton a lot lately.
Love Arlen.
Early on in the pandemic, she went on her virtual book tour, and I was happy to catch her talk. I think it was either with City Arts and Lectures or Commonwealth Club, one of the San Francisco, event series. And Arlen has, such an amazing perspective from her history of how she built Backstage Capital to the number of leaders she gets to work with, to being a manager in her own right. That, her experience and her knowledge is boundless. And every time I hear her, every time I get, a snippet of her thought and advice and takes from Twitter, she's really open. She asks questions of the community that follows her. She listens to those answers. And she has a lot of great things to say, as well as a great example of asking when you don't know. So she's probably one of my top people right now.
Gotcha. Any others? One I could share.
Go ahead, Samantha.
I'll share one very briefly, and it's a little different. And forgive me, for being the lawyer in the room. One thing that's really really special about I recommend, and what I tell people often is learn a little bit more about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what she has done. She's got a lot of publicity in the past 3 years or so, with books, with movies, with things about her life, and all of those things are really fantastic. But one thing that she does that is unprecedented and amazing in every way, that is totally translatable outside of the legal space, is she takes a very large problem and she goes to the core of it and addresses it uniquely and addresses it thoroughly and enforces change and enables change, sometimes with literally a plaintiff. And again, take the legal side out of it. That has been continuously powerful in my career, to watch those things happen when you can go and know you're moving pieces of the mountain one step at a time. And the whole point is the movement. It is the follow through. It is the next steps and the progress. And so that's someone that now is in frail health and is going through a lot, and leaning on those early learnings of what that has done, and how she approached problems. It's a different answer because it's not net new, but it is something I find myself actually going back to a lot in the past 8 months.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think for me right now, just heightened by the times that we're living in right now, and sort of the humanistic element of us all being in our homes, and again showing up as people every single day, which is really what our team and our companies need, is to really see who we are authentically, right? And so I think someone right now who I've watched recently is really around the work that Brene Brown has been doing, and it's really about the power of being vulnerable. Georgina, you talked about, look, when we're talking about these heavy issues of race and or gender or what have you, it comes with some sort of trauma at some point in time, and so building up the courage and vulnerability to talk about those things, and to sort of blend the social into the work environment, I think is becoming more and more powerful. As you sort of show up and authentically lead your team, or work collaboratively. So I think she's done some really great work in that space, and she's got a documentary on Netflix, so go check it out.
Shameless plug. I love it. a follow-up, Corey, and Georgina, I would love for you to tap in on this as well. But what are some of the best practices that you've seen in just trying to hire talent remotely, right? Like in this quarantine world that we're living
in. Georgina, do you want to kick it off or do you want me to go?
No, hiring is your world. So
all right, sure thing. No, so I think a couple things as I sort of led with, right? Empathy and flexibility, right? I think we need to sort of meet our candidates where they're at. And so it's so critical that we approach every single candidate with empathy. We build awareness and, you know, what they're going through, right? You know, we see that, look, this pandemic has you know, adversely and disproportionately affected folks from underrepresented backgrounds and communities. So by no means am I saying like create a narrative or an assumption based on a candidate, but really give all candidates, you know, the option to sort of decline or accept to engage. And so it's really critical, at least for those who are on the recruiting side of the house. You know, we're on the front lines. You know, we're the first interaction, you know, with many of these companies. And so it's important that we think about our language and the power of words when we're reaching out to folks, right? So tweaking the language and how we reach out and source candidates to acknowledge the times that we're in is really important, right? Like, kind of not gone are the days, but some of the, hey, how was your weekend? What did you do? And it's like, you know, I'm a dad or a mom and, you know, the whole day I was spending time with my kid or whatever, right? So I think it's important to think about your language. And then a couple last thoughts here. I think it's so critical to give people the resources to set them up for success during virtual interviewing, right? There's a lot of pressure that comes in. Is my Wi-Fi working? Is my sound on? What does my environment look like? And so this is new for a lot of folks. So really making sure you're giving your candidates guides to set them up for success. So walking through the logistics, right? Setting clear expectations as how the process is going to go. Giving some insight into etiquette, right? Evaluation criteria. How are you going to be evaluated? Even small things like, you know, when you're going to start a virtual interview, maybe if there's a coordinator or if somebody from the team can join in to have some small talk and conversations 15, 20 minutes before, testing the signal, testing the connection. Those are all the things that you can do to set the candidate up for success. And then the last thing that I would mention is really making sure and working with your hiring teams to check our bias and to equip your interviewers with the tools to manage and to mitigate any bias, because bias can creep in a virtual setting. And so it's important that, again, there's tools and resources available to mitigate and to check bias in interviewing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Corey.
I
actually, oh, go ahead, Georgina.
Sorry. No, Corey, I think that was great. And I think the only thing I was going to add is, you know, candidates turn into your new hires, and whether you're at a big company or at a small company, we're all really strapped right now. And, you know, when someone comes into the office, you know what environment they're in, you know that they're sitting next to you. When you're in a meeting with somebody over Zoom or Hangouts or whatever it is you use, you don't know what's in the next room. You don't know what's outside. And so as you're engaging with candidates and giving them an amazing candidate experience and your full attention, when they become a new hire, just because they're a fellow employee doesn't mean in those first couple of weeks you shouldn't also give them that really dedicated focus, because we're all busy. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot going on in our lives. But if you put in a little bit more time with your new hires in their first couple of weeks, a little bit more focus, they'll be more independent. So you can all get back to work a couple of weeks later. Whereas if you don't onboard them in that full proper way, still considering them a candidate, they just made the choice to join your company in one of the most, you know, hard to parse out time that there is. And so continuing that candidate experience through their first, you know, months of employment to make sure they know that you're there and can answer questions, or, you know, setting those boundaries and expectations.
Thank you, Georgina. Sam, a follow-up. What legal implications has just running a fully remote company had on, you know, your company or others operating globally? Because I know on the front lines, like I'm seeing candidates with visa challenges. You know, what legal implications has this had on companies as well?
The full answer to that will take, you know, like 5 days of a webinar. So, you know, we can schedule those out for later. The long and short of it is, it's affected every part of the business, right? And there are geographic challenges that have to be cared for. There's regulatory challenges that have to be cared for. We saw huge shifts, speaking to the UK, the European Union, the US, and Canada, right? We saw huge shifts in the way various governments were willing to step in and understand what was happening to their population base, which is the employees, right? And what's happening with unemployment, what's happening with job transition. And so it is a challenging time for legal and compliance folks, because those regulatory issues are shifting in real time, day to day. And when we first even saw the shelter in place orders come through in the US, as an example, a lot of them started to go into effect the next day or by that night at midnight or what have you. And so we saw, certainly within the tech industry, but in various industries, trying to unpack, what does it mean to be an essential employer? What does it mean to be able to work remotely? Can certain people in our organization work remotely? Can they not? So that was suddenly the new table stakes of what you had to discuss. And then you go down the road of, okay, if there is a forced work from home, what are things I need to consider? Are we in a state or jurisdiction where you're required to make accommodations for working from home? Do we have unique employee experiences that would lead? I love, Georgina, what you said. You don't know what's happening in the next room. Kids are out of school. Children need to be cared for. Older adults and or parent generations might be now living in the home, or someone's in a hospital dealing with something that now is COVID related. There's just, it's much more multifactorial than it was when you saw Corey walking down the hall and saying, hey, Corey, how are you? Good to see you. I know where Corey is. He's in the hallway standing in front of me. So that quickly became a really big additional challenge. And then you start to get into the further nitty gritty that is relevant to this call, which is the understanding of, how do we make sure that as an employee experience, that is the right experience for now, both the employees we have and also the ebb and flow, because as humans, we're also caring for this as a human experience. What am I going through? What is Corey going through? What is Georgina going through? And how does that meld itself into what we're trying to build out? Because at the end of the day, if every tech company goes away, all of our companies on this call, right, we still have each other, and we still have the human base. And so we have to figure out how to care for each other in that way too. And so the empathy and the emotion that comes with that is really quite challenging. And so the practical advice here really is figuring out what level of risk tolerance you have in your business, and what are those key determining factors that hopefully the legal and compliance teams are running for you. But then pouring a bunch of energy into, how do you then care for the humans at your business that you call employees? And if you can do that well, then not only are you setting the business up for success now in COVID times, but post-COVID, whatever that will be and whatever it will look like, but you're also, doing us all a favor in the human side of things too.
Wow, I'm glad I asked that question. What I learned was that there's a huge amount of complexity going on in the background, and that at the core is fundamentally what we're all trying to do, is support the human beings that work for our companies. So before we dive into onboarding, learning development, more retention, I want to circle back to Corey in terms of how we're thinking about sourcing candidates. So Corey, can you talk about, when it comes to, can you share maybe, what you've seen? Because I know you've worked in university programs, so you also have that unique niche perspective, but can you share some of the untapped resources and communities that maybe companies can engage with to hire some of the great underrepresented talent that's still out there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Anthony. And I think even before diving too deep into that sort of specific point, I think at the largest sort of macro level within the tech landscape, as we sort of think about the trends and the themes that are going on, right, there's been about 70,000 people have been laid off from their jobs or have been impacted, right, by a reduction in force since March. So, and that was, coming from I think the Wall Street Journal. But so you kind of think about that, that's an incredibly high number, right? You think of many other companies that have been affected by this. and no one's really, you know, safe from it. And so I think, you know, the first and foremost, like there's a lot of great talent that will be looking for opportunities and that will be looking for jobs, right? So as we think about, and that's folks of all different demographics. So, you know, at that sort of macro level, right, you think about that theme, that's a major one. You think about sort of the reimagining of remote work, right? Samantha will, from a legal perspective, tell you all of the complexities that it comes from. Like, does your company have a legal entity in said state, and all of the different complexities that come along with that. But, you know, I think the tech sector is really going under this sort of reexamination of the future of remote work that all have sort of correlational or potential sort of impact to hiring a more diverse and inclusive work environment. When you think about even like some creative sourcing tactics that I've seen, and again, this is not targeted necessarily toward underrepresented talent, but you know, I've found myself looking at lots of those layoff lists, right? Many companies are putting out lists of employees that were affected. So looking through those lists, right? Looking through LinkedIn feeds, looking through the comments, who's commenting on these things, what are they saying, folks posting about their coworkers or friends, who's liking the content. So you can get lots of sort of leads through that. And then I think, you know, as you think about underrepresented talent and talent in general, like how do we get creative and look beyond just LinkedIn, right? People are becoming more and more social on sites, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, you know, YouTube, whatever that might be. And so really thinking creatively as to like where they're at, right? And, you know, this is above and beyond sort of like the historical like affinity groups and looking through, you know, the Society of Hispanic Engineers or, you know, those affinity organizations. But I think that there's lots of other creative ways that you can do that. I'm thinking in this environment, Anthony, it's really how are we attracting talent to these companies? And so who are those talent magnets in your company that you can sit with and go through their network, right? So like as a recruiter, who are those top people in the company that you can sit down and not just say, hey, Samantha, give me a referral from somebody in your network, but, you know, let's sit down and like look through your network together and look through that talent, right? So I think that that's something that you can do. And the last plug that I would put in from the university perspective, university recruiting tends to act as an accelerator of diversity. And so more and more companies are starting to invest in this level because you have such a wide talent pool. And so the best way to get more diverse talent is to keep putting more at the top of the funnel. So I think that that's another area that companies can re-examine if they haven't done that before. And this virtual thing has allowed us to, historically for campus, right? You have some schools that, or some companies that just target 5 or 6 or 7 schools, but now virtual has brought in and opened the aperture to that, right? And really allowing us to have access to students that might go to a small university in Delaware to have an opportunity to work at a company in the Bay Area.
All right. I guess follow up for Georgina and Sam, maybe, you know, I know sourcing and hiring isn't your specific expertise, similar to Corey and myself, but having had a career, can you kind of maybe even speak to maybe organizations that have made you feel included, whether it's in the recruiting process or when you were onboarded? Can you speak about that from, you know, your perspective as professional?
Absolutely. I was just reflecting, Corey, on a lot that you were saying. I started my first job in the Bay Area in tech was as a recruiting coordinator at Airbnb. And I was, I'm from Berkeley, born and raised, but very new to the San Francisco tech scene, had been an office manager for a company in New York before. And so starting at Airbnb and starting my, you know, career that's led me to my role now in recruiting coordination just taught me a lot about individuals. So I know a lot of folks on this call are in much smaller teams, founding their own companies, maybe don't have the operational system of a recruiter or a sourcer or a recruiting coordinator yet. But the core function of doing that role that I think taught me a lot about what I knew now is that, you know, every single person coming in for an interview, every single person interested in a role at your company is a lot more nervous than you are when you're the person giving them the tour or conducting the interview. And so how can we make them feel like we care about them? How can you, we were talking at the beginning of this call, making sure we could pronounce everyone's name correctly.
Mm-hmm.
When someone walks in the door before you, or, you know, I guess now it's not walks in the door, it's opens their Zoom video. Before even trying to pronounce their name, can you just say, hey, I want to make sure I get your name right. Can you pronounce it for me? Or how has your morning been? I think that when you meet hundreds of candidates over the course of 2 years in a lobby of a company that a lot of people want to work for, you realize people are really nervous. People want to do their best. And so you as an employer have the opportunity to create an environment that makes it feel like you read their resume, you read the emails they wrote you, asking a follow-up question. I think those are things that go so much farther than anyone really imagines when we don't take the time to focus on folks. Something that I've heard our head of inclusion and diversity say at Pinterest is that if you're doing something to empower one community, it really does empower all communities. So let's say you're focused on inclusion for Black lives right now, which is of course what is happening and always really important. Anything we do to make Black folks feel more included at an organization is going to make everyone feel more included at an organization. And so when we think about these rules, when we think about interviewing and making folks feel included, if we think about hiring folks and making them feel included, if you're learning in one arena, it's going to help you in every. And I think that that's something that as an employee, I've gotten to learn over the last few years.
Yeah, Georgina, all the learning and wondering, I think is could be 2 words to describe probably all of us in our lives in this professional, mine included. And so, Anthony, one thing that has stood out in my career journey, which is very unique. That's a whole nother webinar again. So we're planning out a few additional webinars after this one. But I was a teacher. I did curriculum development, and I thought that was my career for a variety of reasons. And what I realized is when I was open to the learning and open to looking around and learning things, the reason I went to law school was actually some volunteer work that I had been doing, and I met some lawyers who were making a difference and really changing things and solving these really interesting problems. And I thought, well, that's not what they show on TV, right? And being sort of just open enough to like have that own learning for myself. And one thing that has been really powerful in my career has been mentors. And I hesitate using that word because it often sounds like there's like, again, sort of a lofty archetype to that ideal. When I say mentors, I'm literally talking about people who know me, Sam, and have talked to me, and I've learned from them, and they've maybe learned a thing or two from me. It's those connections at the heart and soul. It's the connections with people. I have sent countless, even to this day, countless cold messages, instead of cold calls, I don't know what they're called in LinkedIn, cold messages, but to say, hi, I noticed that you did this, and I'm actually trying to hire for this role, and I was wondering if I could talk to you about your experience building out your team in this way. I have made great friends from that, and great people in the network, but it comes from that idea of just being open and pushing, and then also making sure you're doing that on the other side too, putting yourself out there to say, contact me. I would love to put time on my calendar to have time with you. Kate, who's the CMO at Bombas, she started a program for Black professionals to say, hey, here's a list of people in various networks who can go and want to spend time with you. Ping them, here's their calendar invite link. And sometimes that's all it is to get that connection. And so that's what's helped me in my career, is be open to the idea of what's out there and be open to the conversation and the learning that comes.
Thank you. And I want to be mindful of time. I would love to talk more about hiring and especially university recruiting and get your thoughts, Corey. Before we talk more onboarding, learning, development, and retention, any final thoughts, Corey, you have with respect to, the class of 2020 facing, historic, unheard challenges? How are university recruiting programs adapting in the light of the pandemic? And maybe a 2-part, what questions do companies need to be asking themselves so that they're doing the internal work, right, to make these folks feel included?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I was reflecting a lot back to both what Sam and Georgina was saying. And I think at the highest level is as we're thinking about university, what's always been really important to me is just how are we investing in building student capabilities, right? And developing folks. And it's less about how can we just go and extract and pull from different communities, but like how are we actually giving them tools and setting them up for success to make them better across all of our industries, right? Like I would love to build really amazing development programs that, hey, if they end up at Netflix, great. But if they end up and through that program, they're like, hey, I really want to be a lawyer, or hey, I really want to work at, Pinterest, or I want to help build stuff with you, Anthony, or start the VC community, at All Rise, right? Like that's a win for all of us. And so I think, again, for university, that's sort of been one of my guiding principles, is really keep the student first and think about how we can be student centric and everything that we can do to develop and grow and build their capabilities. And then I think just the last thing is just like thinking really differently about how we hire, right? Schools and students are actually used to this virtual environment. So don't stray away from it. If like, hey, they're not going to be in the office, they need a lot of hand holding, this virtual environment is going to be really challenging. Students are already used to it, right? They're already going to be doing that in their course curriculum and at schools and colleges. So, I'm predicting, and I feel like it will be a really easy transition to when companies do that. And so I think continue to sort of double down on the virtual experience. And then the third thing is, again, think differently about hiring, right? So things like micro internships or like short-term sort of working engagements and opportunities are all things that you can consider to really engage in this talent. And then to your second part, Anthony, about about making sure they're set up for success. I mean, I think it's like any other team member, right? Like I think that yes, there's some additional structure, and just as you think about onboarding, and that's why I think it's going to be a really nice transition to hear more from Georgina and team. But I think really talking to them and understanding what their needs are, and ask them, right? Mm-hmm. Don't make assumptions about generational norms or archetypes, but rather ask them, what is needed to be successful.
Like that.
Yeah.
Transitioning on, Georgina, as it relates to the theme that we've had of inclusivity, but even more importantly, retaining the best talent, how is learning and development evolving with the global pandemic?
Absolutely. I can talk a little bit about the onboarding arm of L&D and then the L&D team in general. So I think Corey served me a really nice softball, so I could just go right into onboarding here.
Alley-oop.
When we think about bringing employees in, I think what you said I really resonated with, like not being afraid of the Zoom environment. That was my initial fear when we transitioned our orientation program from in-person to virtual. So I think a lot of bigger companies are used to flying new hires out to where their HQ is, giving them, a week-long kind of boot camp. We called ours Pintro, an introduction to Pinterest. First week experience, so you could feel the mission, feel the values, feel the company culture, meet people on the team. And we put a lot of our success in that kind of ethereal feeling created along with the content given. And so when we started doing Pintro remotely from home, I was really, really nervous about the loss of feeling. I was really nervous as what I was calling to break the video screen. I was nervous to ask folks questions. I didn't want to make people feel like they were on the spot on a video call in front of 40 people. And so our first week was really tentative. And I realized new hires were much more engaged than I thought they were going to be. In the pandemic, in the virtual environment, I thought people were going to be really stressed, but in juggling whatever there is going on at home, new hires want to be successful. Our two main goals of onboarding at Pinterest is getting people up to speed as quickly as possible to feel successful in their roles and making sure they feel like they belong. And being hesitant in that first week of onboarding isn't going to help them feel successful and isn't going to help them feel like they belong. Diving in, making sure that their managers spend good time with them on their first day. It's really important for managers to make that connection over video in person the first day. Getting them a schedule of conversations to have if you're a small company, setting them up to meet everybody on your team in a casual way before you jump into business, and making sure you take the time for them to understand how things have been, the systems that are available, questions that may happen, so that in week 2, week 3, they know where to go to find the information. I know a lot of companies struggle with documenting while you're doing. It's really, really easy to want to build the product or create the flow. But now in a remote environment where meetings are a little bit shorter, you're not sitting next to someone, it's really important to have that documentation available so people can self-learn on their own time if there's a time that doesn't make sense for them to be on a call. So those, I think, are the biggest lessons about onboarding. And then when we go to L&D, our entire L&D strategy at Pinterest is around meeting employees in the moments that matter. We want to have always on learning that's available when you need it. Not everybody needs coaching on anything from public speaking to how to advocate for a raise or how to get ready to have a promotion to the next level. So instead of offering, quarterly trainings where we definitely do have some live trainings, we try to make toolkits and resources available for our employees to get them when they need them. And because of that strategy, we felt really prepared going into a situation you can't really be prepared for. But when we transitioned to work from home, because centered around moments that matter for employees, that first week our team was all hands on deck, listening to all of the webinars that were coming up on how to manage a remote team, how to work from home, how to set up a remote environment, sifting through tons of articles, tons of webinars, tons of resources so we could, curate that first go-to resource for our employees as they were trying to figure out what went on at home. We also restructured all of our goal setting processes. So when we went home, we didn't expect people to be able to complete the same thing that they would have in the office environment. And so how can you set more realistic goals with employees? And I think Corey and Sam have mentioned this, is just starting with a human-centered focus, looking around and saying, who am I? What is my experience with the environment? And assuming that your coworker, the person you're seeing across the Zoom screen, is also trying to figure out who they are as well. So when you're a team that the company is leaning on to guide the way, like L&D, guide the way with that human empathy and that experience. Say, things aren't the same, things are going to be different. We're all going to do our best. And so we want to understand with you what the expectations are and what you need. So those, I think, are the two main things, is in onboarding, making sure you're setting folks up for success and to feel like they belong and not shying away from putting a lot on the calendar in the times that they're free, because new hires aren't busy because they don't know how to do the work yet. And then going into L&D, just focusing on being human with your employees and making sure you have resources available at the moment that they need them.
Thank you, Georgina. You also brought up a good question. I want to get to some of the Q&A, but before we do, you mentioned restructuring the goals setting process. And I actually wanted to have Sam address a question, which is, as a CLO, I know you've had probably some difficult conversations. Some of them might include working with managers and letting talent go, right? So what do you recommend managers and leaders do to prepare for conversations like letting someone go? But more importantly, without it becoming some afterthought, right? Like, how do you bake it in terms of maybe restructuring your goal setting process, right? What are your thoughts there?
It's a great question, and the answer is, so again, multifactorial, but some things that you can sort of apply across the board depending on any company that you're at, right? Transparency is key. And so having transparent policies, having transparent understanding, this goes all the way from job description all the way through the role. As Georgina mentioned, being transparent in the fact that the role has maybe changed, the world has changed, maybe the work has changed. The interesting thing about the legal side of this is that often we find people have had some of the relevant conversations, but they haven't had them thoroughly enough. They haven't documented them enough. And so you'll hear, all of your legal friends saying, well, did you document that? Did you put it in the system? And unfortunately, that's the thing that has to happen on the back end. But if you're transparent throughout the process, then it's actually not a surprise at all when you have potential restructuring of what the job description is. If a role changes, change the job description and make sure that you have those conversations about the skill sets and what is now required and or different about the role, especially when you see roles shift from maybe manager to IC, individual contributor, or back the other way, right? or when things change because of now an audience or a partner or an internal group that was no longer a part of a certain process, it's really important to start somewhere. And typically I say that's something you talk with your HR, your ER team. At Enjoy, we call them the people team, because we believe we're a people first company and we're all just people trying to do this work. But start there and go to the legal and compliance team and understand what is that thing that they can all do to help enable those conversations. Additionally, as you go through the process with an employee, if they are underperforming or if they aren't meeting those standards at the job description level or the standards that the manager has set, that's often, again, a great time for conversation on both the manager and the employee, because all too often we find that there's a gap, and there's potentially a gap not because of skill, but because of expectation setting and because of conversation. And so emotions get involved when it's not clear why there's a gap or that there is even a gap. But when you can solidly address, here's what the expectation was, here's how it got communicated or looked like, and here are the things that we need to help enable growth or development or performance improvement, right? Again, a lot of these terms are things that the tech company has done a magnificent job of getting away from the old school way of talent management and really into these new forms of consistent feedback. Feedback is a loop that should be ongoing every single day. And the more you can remind managers, individual contributors, all employees, heads of business, teams, executives, everyone needs to remember that, right? Because if you have that feedback, then you have the ability to have a conversation. And I have guided many teams in many different areas around how to walk through an exit strategy with someone. And sometimes I'll tell you that exit strategy is being requested on behalf of that employee. It's not sometimes remember, the employee chooses the company just like the company chooses the employee. So sometimes it's not a situation of you're underperforming and now we have to figure out a next plan. Sometimes this just isn't a good fit anymore because something has changed in some way, shape, or form. And so remembering that, being transparent in the process, being transparent with managers about what's required in the process, because employees, just like we care so deeply about bringing them on in a really great way, as Georgina walked us through, we have to care deeply about what that experience is out the door. And it's a lot less sexy of a topic to go on the outside part, but it's equally as important to allow people the opportunity to exit in a way that they feel proud of and that the company feels good about. And I'll end it by looping back to something, Corey, I think you said. When we bring candidates in, we're meeting them where they are. Where are you as a candidate right now, and how do we grow you? That's what I did as a teacher all day long. That's what we're also here as humans doing. It's challenging, but try and apply that same logic to when you have to go through either growth and development plans or terminations and exit discussions. That same idea. Let us meet you where you are and figure out what the right next steps are together. And if you can do that, the employee bases will be happy, and the folks entering and leaving will also understand that the business is providing a foundation for understanding across all their employees at every stage.
Thank you, Sam. We have two quick questions from the audience that I want to address. Thank you for reminding me, Corey. One was, Allraise is primarily an organization about small companies, and this person is hearing about ERGs and HR folks that likely don't exist in small companies, right? So when there isn't a dedicated owner of D&I at a company, how can a founder who cares about this and likely has to do it on their own because they don't have the support, how do they go about making change and getting bottom-up support and ownership within their organization for this?
Yeah, I can start with this one, and it kind of goes in line with what Sam was mentioning. But you know, I think the first and foremost piece of it, right, is like we all need to own it, right, at the company, right. It's not a singular person's job, and that, like, as you think about your company values, is it a value? Like, is it something that is at the heart or of the core of your company? And maybe question yourself, should it be? I mean, maybe it might, maybe it shouldn't, but Maybe it should, if it's something that you're really passionate about. So think about how it plays into your company values beyond just like the social and moral sort of implications of having really strong D&I practices. The other thing that Sam was mentioning is as you're creating processes and systems, one of the glory of building it from the bottom up is that you can start and really examine it for how you want it to be built, and then continue to revisit that. And so, issues of systemic racism and things like that over time are a result of process and bias, right? And so as you're continuing my recommendation, as you're continuing process, or as you're continuing building out the different sort of systematic operational things that you're going to do, continuing to examine it for bias and who it benefits or who doesn't it benefit, I think will be really critical in actually creating a really inclusive environment. As and again, I can't speak to the specifics of your company, but I think that's something that I would recommend. And really quickly, last thing, we did John and John Zimmer and Logan Green, the founders of Lyft. They spoke to our interns, and one of the questions was, if you could do this all over again, like what would you do differently? And one of the things he said was, I would have emphasized hiring a person dedicated to culture and people in the same way that I emphasize rapid growth and scaling, because the power of people and culture is truly dynamic, and I would allocate a resource to that sooner.
Yeah. Jumping right off of that, what I was going to say is, as a founder who cares about D&I, I think it's really important to set goals in the same way that you would about, whatever your product is. So D&I at every company is making sure your product is an inclusive experience for every user, and also making sure your employment journey is a place that anyone from any background can feel included in. And so when you're starting out early and you're making those first goals, if you set them as OKRs, however you do, create a goal about that. The way to make shared ownership is to put it on a piece of paper. It needs to be part of your mission. It needs to be part of your core values, because if it's just, oh, we all care about D&I, but it's not explicitly stated anywhere, then what's holding you to account? What's creating accountability, and how do you measure your progress? And so I think if you're an early founder who cares about this, you have an opportunity to, learn from the mistakes, learn from what the founders of Lyft were saying, make it part of how you want to grow soon, and measure yourself against it, and make sure you set it for the whole company and you can all work together.
Gotcha.
For medium-sized businesses, I'm cognizant too that even a lot of mid-sized businesses or businesses that are just getting started, they also run into that same problem of we don't have the headcount, we don't have the resources. And one additional tip is to, when you put it down on paper, as Georgina said, just start small and start by pieces, because that paper, that roadmap, is showing you that marathon. We started this discussion saying this is a marathon. And so it's showing the route of the marathon, and then people can be part of each one of those processes. But there is an immense pressure to complete the whole marathon and all the things on the piece of paper. Mm-hmm. And when you don't have dedicated resourcing, you might not be able to do that as quickly as you want to, but it is the goal. It is the thing, it is the North Star that you're shooting for when you put it down like that.
Gotcha. We have 3 more quick ones, so I'm gonna try to keep our comments a little bit short, because I know we all have like some valuable gems that we want to share. But follow-up was that this panel mentioned leaning on underrepresented folks to understand how to build a more inclusive environments within the company. But they've also heard from folks who are underrepresented that they hate that they're asked to do, free consulting on being a minority in a company. So what's your answer here to this?
In my experience, if you set time for folks to talk, it's not a requirement of all employees. It's just an option to give the time for folks to come and give feedback and create a safe space. And folks who, do want to be part of the conversation can come, but absolutely don't require anyone to do any unpaid or emotional labor that they're not wanting to volunteer for in the first place. And if you're finding at your company or in your organization, if it's small enough that you don't have the people there to, listen to yet, I would say, like Sam was talking about, reach out for leaders in peer companies and see what their experience has been if they're a little bit farther down the road than you, and learn from those experiences.
All right, thank you. A second one was they like to ask from Samantha, what kind of procedure will they have to follow when they join a company as a talented overseas employee after quarantine?
Well, a lot of that's still yet to be determined, but a lot of it has to do with, we talked a little bit earlier about, do you have entities? Do you have a nexus? Does the company have a way to do business there? So that's always step one. Global mobility is really important, right? And then step two is all of the immigration issues that may or may not be a part of the right to work in a certain place at a certain time for a certain period of time. And certainly we're even going to learn more after December 31st in the UK and the EU and those implications. And then lastly, it would be company specific around the policies and procedures that then apply to you. Those things might relate to stock options. They might relate to employment practices and policies, even things granular like PTO or unlimited PTO or whatever the case may be. All of those remain jurisdictionally specific. So it's really important to understand what that package looks like for you as it relates to your new jurisdiction.
And then last two, and I'm going to combine them because I think they're very similar. But we talked about D&I really being everybody's responsibility, right? But the questions were, whose responsibility is it, right? Is it the head of D&I? Is it the CEO? But then the second question I'm hearing is, maybe you've communicated that, it's everyone's responsibility. The second two part of this question is, what happens if maybe you're a manager or an individual contributor and the management team isn't bought into D&I urgently or personally? I'm not sure what that second part means. But yeah, if you're having trouble getting buy-in, but you learned from this panel that it kind of takes a village to do it, how do you navigate that challenge?
Corey, did you want to go?
It's a great question. I think, as we've all said, right, as we think about, right, is the first part of that is DE&I everyone's responsibility or not, and kind of, who's doing what, if it's everybody's responsibility, what's actually truly getting done. And so I think my follow-up question would just be, how do we ensure that accountability measures are put in place? And so as Sam was talking through, right, how do you put down, some of your actions, right? Again, it's a marathon, it's a mountain that we're climbing. How do we get to different base camps over time, right? It's not one individual leader per se. Obviously, it's great to have, if the resources are available, to allocate some dedicated resourcing toward it. But I think, the better question is to even think about, if that's not the case, is how do we hold each other accountable for that? So I think accountability metrics is something that's really important. And then for the buy-in piece, I'm open to the group's thoughts, but I think I would be curious to know, like, why aren't they bought in? And I typically ask the question when folks say to me, like, hey, like, why is D&I important? I often like to ask the question, why isn't D&I important?
Yeah.
And if you can convince me that, hey, there's a business case for homogeneity, I have yet had somebody do that yet, but, it comes down to, like, our business vitality is around, as Georgina was saying, creating diverse and inclusive experiences, not only for our workforce, but then also our customers and consumers.
Totally. And I don't know the legal implications about what I'm going to say. So Sam, that can be for you. But I think if a manager or a leader in your company doesn't believe in the vision for your company, you should reconsider if they're the right person. If somebody came to you with the OKRs that you'd outlined about growth goals or about product roadmap, and they disagreed with you, would you think they were the right fit? If your company is valuing diversity in its product and in its employees, and you have a leader who disagrees with that, I would ask you to consider what you're going to do in the same way you would if they disagreed with your product. I think it's something to be taken really seriously.
Yeah, I completely agree, Georgina, and that's the beauty of that transparency, right? Like if this isn't a value, why isn't it a value? And if this is a value on paper, but no one's actually doing any of the work to make it such, then it's the same thing as it not being a value. And so asking the right questions of the companies when that might be the case, and asking the right questions of managers or leaders when that might be the case. Of course, there's politics involved. Of course, everyone knows everyone, but that shouldn't stop anyone, employee or otherwise, from having a conversation about what the expectations are and answering the questions. They are equally, if not more important than any sales goal, any revenue goal, any commission structure for a company. And again, back to sort of our human base on the whole.
Yeah. I want to be mindful of time. We're about 5 or 6 minutes over the hour, so I'm going to give it back to Marion. But thank you all for showing up, and I'm going to let Marion close us off with final thoughts.
Yes, thank you to all of you for really sharing best practices and how things are done, and just really the empathy piece. So with that, thank you again for your time. For everyone on the line, this will be posted within the next week on the All Raise page, and we look forward to seeing you all on other events. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.